Today we're going to be talking about identifying your skills. And the reason we do this so early in the program is that this really dictates everything else you do, from your resume, from applications, which we'll be talking about today, to your interview, the types of jobs you apply for. Many people start their job search by and I totally understand that. You go online and you say, I've done this type of work before, and I'm going to just apply for this. And sometimes it'll work very well. However, it's been my experience that the more time at the beginning of your job search that you spend kind of identifying what you have to market about yourself, the easier it is to be making those applications, to be sending out those resumes, to be creating those resumes, and it'll really help guide you in what to talk about in the interview itself. So what we're going to do today, we're going to understand the importance of knowing your skills. We're going to be able to define what are called transferable skills, and then we're going to know how to identify those transferable skills. By the way, career force locations throughout Minnesota may be closed physically, but we are open virtually. So I will be giving you contact information for contacting your local career force location if you do have additional questions after today's workshop. So I never call this a test. I call it a quiz. People get test anxiety when you put the term test on. But I'm just going to ask you, and I want you to put it into the chat box after I define a skill, some answers to some questions. So be prepared to. The chat box is the bottom right-hand side of your screen. It looks like a speech bubble or a call out. And they'll be just simple numbers answers. So first off, we're going to talk about what a skill is. A skill is simply anything you can do. Now, anything you can do well. And I'm not talking about breathing or walking. I'm talking about things like, maybe you're good at a drill. You can operate a drill press, or you can, you have a special engineer's boiler's license, or you're good at Excel. Those are all skills, okay? The question I'm going to ask you is, how many skills do you think the average person, an average person across the board, not someone who's got a doctorate in whatever, or 20 years of experience, how many skills does the average person have, do you think? I'm just going to take a look at the chat box here, and we see 10, 20, less than 10 for a job. Someone said they quantified it, 5. Okay, 30. Well, that's pretty open-ended. So, yep. And by the way, good point to make. Your mics have been muted. The first slide. The reason we do that is we have over 100 people on today's workshop, and it would not work well if we had the mics over. So you put your questions through the chat, obviously. So the average person has 500 to 800 skill sets. And I do get a lot of pushback on that, because people say there's no way I have that many skill sets, or you're getting into things that are too simplistic. I believe this thoroughly. I don't think you have to identify 500 to 800 skill sets, but if you think of your career and what you've done in the past, you may think of things like, a skill set I have is I'm a trainer. Okay, I train people on various topics. Okay, so my first question would be, what kind of topics do you train on? What do you have subject expert qualifications for? So those would be skill sets. Training itself involves public speaking. It requires, putting together maybe a PowerPoint. It deals with overcoming objections, compromise, scheduling. There's all sorts of things that come together, a whole bunch of skill sets that come together that we call a job. A welder is another great example of this. So if I were to say my skill set is I'm a welder, I know how to weld, I would break that down to, okay, what kind of welding do you do? Do you do something called MIG or TIG or cast iron or aluminum? Do you use a settling tank or settling torch? Do you use a plasma cutter? There's so many things that to allow us to do a job, and those things are called skills. When we break down that information, we're able to then transfer those skills to new opportunities. You may not be able to transfer a trainer position title to an HR representative. You might say, well, that's not the same job. Well, a lot of the skills are the same. And once you break down the skills, you can market yourself to a new opportunity. And that's why it's so important, because in many cases, the job we did before is not the job we are looking for now, or the job that's available to us. So we're changing kind of what we are marketing about ourselves above and beyond our work history to make us relevant to new positions. And we'll break that down kind of as we go. So the reason this is so important is this question. How many skills can the average person identify? And I took a look, and I see everywhere from 5 to 30, and it might have been above. The average person can identify 10 skills. Okay? And sometimes that's hard. I've done this in a live workshop where I've had people take a piece of paper, and I said, okay, I want you to list all the skills you have. And some people would be done in 30 seconds. Some people would never have been done in the 4-hour session that I was putting together, because they were thinking of their skills differently. They have already gone through that process. But 10 is a pretty good number to start with, but it's not something you should stop at. Now, obviously, all of these skills that you identify are not going to be relevant to every position, but I don't even play the game at the beginning. I always think of, I don't know what positions might come out there. So, if you juggle, hey, put that down. Maybe there's a clown job coming up. I don't know. Just list everything you can think of on a blank piece of paper, dump it all down in there, and then now you have a base of skill sets to start drawing from, to think about, okay, which ones are relevant to the positions I'm applying for, and how can I prove to an employer skills? What are some successes that have come to my employer through me using these skills in a job? Okay, so because the average person can only identify 10, this next question I just love. What percentage of people cannot identify, sell, or prove their skills during an interview? And I'm just going to give you this number. You don't even have to put it in. I'm going to give you this number. The number is 80%. And let me tell you why that number makes a lot of sense. Many of the job seekers I have been in contact with over the years will spend a lot of time and effort in prepping for their job search. They will fill out an application meticulously. They will get a lot of help on their resume, and they will get a lot of feedback, and they'll get that really good. And then they'll get that job interview. At that point, for whatever reason, their preparation stops. And they think, well, I can't prepare. I don't know what questions they're going to ask. So I'm just going to go in there and be very natural. I don't want to sound scripted. So I'm going to go in there and just react. The problem with that is there are 4 other people usually competing with you at that stage. I mean, you've increased your chances of getting that job a lot by getting to the interview. But even at the interview stage, use the interview pool of 5 people as an example, you've got a 1 in 5 chance, which is a 20% chance of getting that job, all other things being equal, which means that you have an 80% chance, that number you see right here, of not getting that job. I don't mean that to be a downer. It's great that you got to the interview, but that's when you really kick in all of your preparation and think, okay, they're telling me exactly what they need through this job posting. Well, as much information as I can get at least. And they're saying you need to have this, 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 and this. It's my job as in interview prep to identify what skills, what successes I can market about myself to prove to them I could do this, because they don't know. They only know what you tell them. So we talk about this in the interview class, but I'm just gonna give you a little heads up on this. When you go into an interview, it's a give and take. They're going to be asking you a lot of questions, but you control most of the conversation because you spend more time answering questions than they do asking. So if you have a goal going into an interview of, here's the 10 skill sets out of maybe the 30 or 40 that I've identified that I need them to know. They need to know I have these 10 skills to bring to this position. If you have that goal going in, you can work those skills into a whole bunch of the questions they ask. Okay, so many people feel somewhat powerless going into an interview because they're reacting to questions. But if you have a goal going in, you're really controlling a lot of what is given and taken during an interview. I think that's extremely important and not obvious. So that's why I like to bring it up. Before we move on, I want to stop, and I'll do this occasionally, to see if Glory has identified any questions we need to get to. Glory?
Well, I tell you, we have some great comments. Rachel commented that she usually Googles the company and learns as much as she can about the company before she goes into the interview. And I also just want to point out that I completely agree with this as far as 80% of people do not know their skills. So if you know your skills, that gives you one up compared to everybody else who's interviewing. I know that in my past, when I would do interviewing, it was really fascinating how people could tell me all the things they couldn't do. And we don't typically talk about I am punctual, I am dependable. But at the interview is the time you have the permission to, I call it tooting your horn. You have the permission to talk about the great things that you are.
Perfect. Exactly right. And you know, some of the things we take for granted as skills, other people don't possess. Think of it. If you've gone into you've been with an employer and there were coworkers who didn't show up for work, and that bothered you, you know, because they weren't they didn't show up, they weren't dependable or punctual, but you were. You don't have to throw anyone under the bus, but think about it. That's a skill set you brought to that job. You may have just assumed it was everyone has that, but I think we all know not everyone does. From this point on, I'm going to be waiting until Glory turns on her video, as she just did, and that'll tell me if there are questions, and I believe she has a question.
I do. I think this is the one that was really worthy of just commenting on. Rachel wrote, I have skills, but it's something that I struggle with. I haven't moved up from being a cashier. I've been striving to break into freelance writing, but that has been difficult. Can you kind of comment a little more on that, Art?
Sure. One of the things I'm going to recommend everyone do on the Career Force website, there's a skills identification survey. Basically, you just go on. It's an assessment. You go on and you talk. There's 3 assessments there, and I'll give you links to all 3. And it'll say, what have you done in the past? So cashier is a great example. I'm not saying specifically towards writing, but in this example, I'm going to use a cashier experience. Cashiering, you create a lot of customer service skills. You also have cash handling. So that could lead to potentially a teller position at a bank because they require cash handling experience. And if you don't have it, that's a deal breaker to get to that level. And then within a bank, they train you from within, and that's a career path. So there's not a job out there that doesn't create transferable skills. But if you want to say, what are the matches between what I've done in the past and what I want to do in the future? There are tools out there, and I'll be giving you links on that about how to find what are the transferable skills between positions. And I do recommend you take a look at those. Another thing with assessments are sometimes part of the application process. So just going through assessments and understanding how they're phrased and how you should answer them is important. And the more you take before you have to take one, meaning it's part of an application, the more prepared you're going to be. And I usually recommend being honest and not reading into those assessments. Just give your honest answer, because otherwise what you end up doing is trying to answer the way you think they want you to answer, and you end up tripping yourself up later on when they ask you a clarifying question. So great question, great comment, Rachel, thank you. Skills are developed through a variety of methods, and I would say at least 50% of the time when you have a question that has all the above option, that's the answer. But I like to point this out because they're in order of, in many cases, what employers value. Okay, work experience, for whatever reason that skipped on me, I'm gonna go back here. Work experience is the key. That's the top one, but it's not always what we have. Sometimes if we're just coming out of an educational experience, we may not have work experience, but we may have a degree. So in that case, education would come before work experience. But for someone like myself, whose education is decades in the past, I'm not going to talk about my education as the most important thing because it's not the most relevant. Because I have work experience between that education and this new opportunity to talk about successes and how I've used that education and I've developed that experience. There are exceptions to every rule based on your specific circumstance. And if you have questions about, what's the most relevant skills I should be talking to an employer, then that's a great time to reach out to your local career force location and ask to speak one-on-one to a career specialist. Like I said, I'll be giving everyone contact information for that. Volunteer work can be very beneficial if you do not have related work experience. Volunteer work plays a part in, can play a part in a variety of different ways in your employment employment seeking. It doesn't always have to be on your resume. So just because you volunteer doesn't mean you have to put it on there. But if it has a purpose, certainly consider it. So if you've had some leadership experience doing volunteer work, but you don't have it during your work experience, perfectly legitimate to put it on your resume. Because it's a required skill set that you have. It's just not through a work experience. Also, volunteer work can help tell an employer what you've been doing while you've been unemployed, potentially. Or it could meet the need for a cultural fit. Maybe it's a business that is extremely environmentally conscious. And maybe your past work experience doesn't reflect that, but your volunteer work does. So then you can put it on there. I always just say, though, if there's no reason to put a volunteer work, consider its relevance. Always consider everything you put into your job search based on relevance to the intended target, not just something you're proud of, okay? Socializing with people, that's important because people skills, soft skills are really important in every job. With others. So if you're someone who is just very naturally outgoing, that could be a benefit to an employer. And those are skills you developed without even thinking about it. Hobbies is a little more difficult. Only one time have I, in my own personal life, used hobbies as a method of promoting a skill set. And the reason was I didn't have it through work experience. I didn't have it through volunteer work, but it was something that was directly relatable that I did in my own time for my own benefit that an employer would find value in. But always be careful about that. People coming out of college are often told, show your full self, put your hobbies, put your all sorts of things on there. The reason for that in many cases is lack of work history, and it needs to fill out or flesh out a resume. If you have work experience, that's the most important thing. You do not have to put hobbies on your resume, nor should you unless it serves a purpose. And then sports is kind of a catch-all for could be volunteer work, it could be hobby, but it also can be organizational. There's some real skills that are developed through sports. If you've ever coached, as I have, a t-ball team, patience, oh my gosh, think of all the patience that you've developed through that, and organization and dealing with conflict. There's a lot there. Before we move on, I'm going to stop for a minute. Glory?
Is there a website that can help identify skills? That's the question.
Yep, right on the Career Force website, there is a skills identification exercise that I'll be sending everybody. I'll take a look through some of the other material I have. That is a really great place to start. There's also a really nice new product we have out there. I hate to use the word product. Everyone can access it for free. It's the top 30 jobs in demand through COVID. And it'll tell you what the most in-demand jobs are, and it'll talk about the skills required of those jobs. So once you've identified your skills through one of the assessments, you can match those skills to jobs in demand. And I have to tell you, it's pretty shocking sometimes what types of jobs come up. You say, I've done this, I like to do this, and then it'll spit out, well, you would be somewhat qualified to do this type of work. And the times I've taken these assessments, sometimes I'm like, I don't get it. Why would that relate? Because I'm looking through a very narrow focus. I'm looking at job titles. I'm not looking at skill sets. So someone, taking an objective look at your career will notice things and point things out that you maybe never even considered. All right, we're going to move on. So the skills that are most important to employers, I did kind of mention this a little bit before, is soft skills, people skills. How will you fit in? How will you adapt or learn, especially at interview? And this, to me, it took me a little bit to buy into this, and I totally do now, because if you think about it, at interview, everyone's qualified for the job. That's why we have the application. You're dealing with 4 other, I hate to use the word competitors, but you're dealing with 4 other candidates that are all at least meeting the basic qualifications of the job. At the interview, they're going to ask you questions about the specific hard skills of the job, but they're going to ask you a lot of questions that deal with soft skills. If you've ever been asked a behavioral-based question, something like, give me a time when you've had a disagreement with a coworker, how did you handle it, and what were the results to that relationship? Those are the types of questions that really throw people, because they're not about how do you put together this part, how do you create this spreadsheet. It's how do you deal with people. They're soft skills. And the more time you put into developing success stories for soft skills, the easier it's going to be to market those skills. And it is part of every interview that I've been a part of. And it's, in my experience, what people are least prepared to talk about. In the interview portion, we talk about how you go about doing those, how you go about answering those questions. But the first thing you need to do is understand, what are your skill sets? Is it communicating? Is it conflict resolution? There's a lot that starts this process, and then developing those success stories is the next step. Glory?
Yeah, I always say too that, I can teach you the skills and how to do the job, but I can't teach you how to be nice to someone and how to get
Yes.
along with others.
Yeah.
So that is a great, huge, huge skill in itself. We do have a question here. Let's see, now I gotta scroll back. Oh, cold emails. What do you think about that, Art? If someone were to send a cold email to an employer and ask for jobs and tell them about your skills, would that be a good thing to do?
Well, I'll tell you what. I've received them in the past. It depends on the employer, obviously, and the larger the employer, usually the less reaction you're going to get to that, because they have a process and they've got to be very careful about treating everyone the same. They have to post a job, they have to be able to track applicants to that job, and that's how they go about it. That's why, and I totally get this, many people are frustrated. Job fair, remember in-person job fairs? We haven't done those for a while, but they'd go to an employer and they would say, well, here's my resume. Here's my resume. I want to apply to a position. And the employer would say, well, I can't take that. I can't take that resume because that's an unsolicited application. And people get very frustrated by that. Don't be frustrated. That's just their process. It doesn't hurt to ask. It doesn't hurt to try. In fact, if I really want to work for an employer, I'll stop in and I'll ask. I'll ask, if there are any jobs, or if they foresee any jobs being posted in the future. Here's a really good tip. Find out as much as you can. Someone talked about it already. Research the company. Find out what jobs they have. So if you go in and you cold call them, personally or over the phone, or I'd looked at your company website and I see that you do not currently have any customer service positions open, but I did hear in the paper that you got a new contract. Do you anticipate hiring anyone in the next 2 months? Because I would love to send my resume in for someone to take a look at. Now, you're going to hear no on that a lot, but all you need is one yes. Being able to hear no and being willing to hear no means you're job searching the way you should. Now, everyone's comfort level is different on that. Every is different on that. But in my case, I'll hear no once, and if I do, they probably, at the very least, I've talked to somebody at that company. They know I'm interested. They've heard my name. They've heard my voice. I've got to be polite about it, obviously, but it's part of job search that very few people are comfortable doing because they're afraid of hearing no. I like to hear no at least once per day in my job search. That's how I know. Go till no, without being pushy. All right. So how does identifying your skills help you in your job search? Well, we've talked about this a little bit. Knowing your skills is essential for writing an effective resume. If you know your skills, you're better prepared for the interview and to market yourself in networking situations. When you're talking to people, what are you going to talk to them about? When someone asks you that question, the first question anyone asks you is, what's your name? Okay, or it comes about. The second question they ask is, what do you do? Now, if you're unemployed, that's not a comfortable question to answer. But being prepared for saying, you know, for the past 10 years, I've been a customer service rep at a local, you know, airplane manufacturer. Currently, I'm looking to leverage some of those skills in sales to this industry. They asked, give them what we call an elevator speech. It's just a, you know, a quick 10-second introduction to what value I could bring to an employer. If you're prepared for that, it potentially could lead to further conversation. It could lead to a job lead. It could lead to a job. It has for me. I have put out a 10-second elevator speech at a meeting I was at once, and it led to a successful contract. That never would have happened if I hadn't told people, not just my job title, but what that job title would mean to them, okay? So it helps to prove your abilities to potential employers. Also helps you to write your resume and complete applications. We'll be talking about those in just a moment. And then it helps you sell your qualifications in an interview. Now we have a diagram here that talks about the 3 types of skill sets. You have soft skills, which we talked about already. Those are the kind of the people skills. Job skills are specific to a job industry. Always explain your skills to the intended audience. You know, you don't, just because you have highly technical skills and this incredible amount of experience, if that's not required for the job, you don't need to mention it. Market to what the need is, not to what you possess. You can always go a little above and say, here's some additional skills that I believe could benefit this job. That's okay if you've identified them, but you don't want to talk about things that don't relate to the needs of the position. And then the transferable skills are maybe describing what you did in this previous job that relates to what they're asking for. So here's just a really simple example. If you were an educator, you may say that's training. You know, I was an educator I taught classes. Well, you train people on how to do things. And maybe they're not looking for a trainer now, they're looking for a facilitator. So you go from educator to trainer to facilitator. You still have to be honest, and you still have to be able to stand behind it. But transferable skills are not always going to have the same name between how you identified it and how the employer identified it. So looking at those terms and saying, truthfully, could I frame my skill set under that heading? If you can, that's a transferable skill set. Said, my people have the confidence of their convictions and they know their skills. And I think that is so important in job search, because unless you know your skills, they'll never know what you have to offer. You don't want to leave anything off the table. Employers at an interview have a very short period of time to figure out who is going to be the best candidate. It's really important for you to do all that work for them. Think about, if I were the employer, what would I need to know about me to get this job? And if you've taken that time, we don't get that many interviews. If you've taken the time to do that, you still might not get the job, but at least you competed at the highest level you could for that position, okay? All right. Camera on, so we're not going to stop for questions, but this is kind of a checkpoint to let you know that know the 3 types of skills, understand the importance of identifying those skills, and then know how to identify your skills. And like I said, I will be sending everyone a skills identification assessment and worksheet. And I'll be actually giving you a couple of worksheets that you can fill out, you can print off, and it'll be like job title, and then what skills did I utilize within that job title, and you can kind of go through your work history, and it just gives you a formula to kind of work through that. All right, we're going to move on to applications. So have your information ready before you start. I was just working on with another department here at the state, putting together a fillable employment, you know, kind of personal data that you will. I'll send that. I think it's available now. If not, I'll send you the previous version. but it's just a document where you can put in the dates, the addresses, the contact information, the phone number, and save that. This is something you can do beforehand. This is something you can do right now. If you're uncomfortable with everything I'm talking about today, just get your job history down. Get the contact information. Call former employers to get dates of employment. That's not always a comfortable call, but it's important because when you fill out an application, they're asking, when did you work? And if that could lead to you telling a lie. I mean, it's not something you're trying to do, but it is a lie. And I know people who have been fired from jobs because they had the wrong dates. Usually that's not the primary reason they were fired, but it was the backup for that employer to make that decision to say, you falsified data. Or if they called a check, they will call employers if you allow them, and sometimes even if you don't. And if they call to check and verify dates of employment and the employer says you worked there 2 years less than you put on your resume, that's an easy out for the employer. They just say, well, okay, they falsify data on here. Usually it's not on purpose. It's just because we didn't verify that information. So be positive and honest. Make sure that you're getting all the information you can. Use the keywords on applications. If they are asking for something that you are describing in a different manner, like facilitator versus trainer, they're human. They're looking for words just like a computer would or an applicant tracking software would. And even if a human sees a different word than what they're looking for, they're skimming through it and they may not see the relevance. Lori?
So I think this is a great question, Art. It says, how far back do you need to go on the job applications? And do you need to list every single place that you've worked related to the industry?
That's a it depends answer. Usually what we say is 10 to 15 years is sufficient. Some employers will ask for everything. That's pretty rare, but specific knowledge of any employer's needs trumps anything, I'm going to say. But 10 to 15 years is usually okay. If it's industry specific. If 15 years ago you had a very relevant job to the employment that you're going to work with, trying to get now, and you don't show that in your most current 10 to 15, then you can make that determination, should I put that? But if something is going back to the 90s, it's kind of crazy to think that the 90s were over 20 years ago. Then you ask yourself, how relevant is it? Do I still have those skills? Would it be better to leave it off than to put it on? And that's a great conversation to have one-on-one with a career force specialist.
All right, yes, excellent. The next question, Art, is what if you were working and due to COVID, your job no longer exists? What do you put on the application for that situation?
It would depend on, how the employer phrased it. Was it a permanent layoff? Was it, there's all sorts of different terms, and just use the terms that are most relevant. That's a question we get every single workshop we do. And the reason is many people that are here today are in unfamiliar territory. They're not seasonally laid off every year. They don't know how to deal with this because they've been working for the last 10 years and they've never experienced this before. Well, let me let you know, you're not alone. A lot of people are dealing with this, and employers know that. There are currently 86,000 jobs posted on minnesotaworks.net, which is the state's job bank. Employers are clamoring for people to work. If you're someone who is actively seeking, the fact that you were laid off due to COVID, phrase however you would like. You can say permanent layoff due to site closure. You don't have to put COVID in there. They understand what's been happening with the economy. If you're concerned about it, certainly reach out to us and we can help you. But I want to kind of take that pressure off you. Employers are used to it. They know what's going on. We'll take one more question and then we'll have to move on.
Yes, and we're down to just one more, so we're
okay,
keeping up here. So this person is saying, I only have a month and year for start and end dates. Some applications want month, day, and year. How often does this happen? And is it important to reconnect with the employers?
I always try to get the exact dates. If that's, and by the way, when people say, no, it's impossible, I've personally in the past worked with people where it took an hour and we were able to figure it out. But if it's absolutely not possible and you know the month and the year, put the first day of that month. Don't, when you say April 17th, that tells me that that's the exact date. When you put April 1st, 2010 through January 1st, 2015, that at least gives you that idea that I'm just giving you the month, even though it requested the day. If at all possible, you want to get that date. And I would call former employers. There's a couple different reasons to call former employers. One, reconnecting. Who knows? Maybe they have work. If you were fired from that position, maybe you ask, I'm requesting dates of employment to fill out my applications. Would also like to know, when employers call to verify employment, what information do you give out? Because on the application quite often says, may we contact your former employer? And if you've been fired from a job, people are really reluctant to do that. And I understand, good people get fired from jobs every day. I'm not putting any value on that. It's just that it's an uncomfortable situation because that relationship ended badly. If you've heard directly from them that they only give dates of employment, then you can check that box. Yes, you may contact them, because that doesn't raise any flags. When you say, no, you may not contact my former employer, look at that through the eyes of the current job you're trying to get. How would you think about that? So there's a lot of good things that can happen if you contact your former employer, even though it might be an uncomfortable conversation. I'm going to mention one more thing on this, especially for government work, for state jobs. If they require 2 years of employment and you are right at the edge of it, make sure you use exact dates, because they can't guess. They can't give you credit for something you didn't specifically list. So if you said you worked from, let's say you just did years. I worked from 2004 through 2009. They can only assume the last day of the first year and the first day of the last year, if that makes sense. So they're going to assume the lowest possible amount of time unless you specifically tell them otherwise. I learned that the hard way. Many people learn that the hard way when they apply for government jobs and they say, I was really qualified for this. Why didn't I get an interview? And in some cases, it's because dates weren't specific enough, and they can't give you credit for something you didn't specifically list. All right, applications are also a time to sell your skills by using your space wisely. You don't have to write a book, but be aware that applications and resumes are two different documents, and they're seen separately in many cases by different groups of people. I get this question a lot. Why do I have to put this on my resume if I already put it on the application, or vice versa? Some people will leave work history off their resume, saying that that's already shown on my application. I want to use this space more wisely. Unfortunately, that's quite often going to bite you, because employers still look at resumes and they need to stand on their own. People who interview are looking at a resume, and quite often, and I was shocked by this, don't ever see the application. That's HR. HR forwards on the resumes, and you're looking at it and you're saying, I don't see what's relevant here. And you already have predetermined, unfortunately, that interview panel might have the relevance of your job. So you're fighting an uphill battle even if you get the interview. So those two documents need to stand on their own. They don't have to be a copy and paste from one to another, but sometimes they are. Sometimes you upload your resume into an application, make sure everything goes into the right places, and expand if they give you some more space. Lori?
I think too, a lot of times companies will use the application and the resume to compare to see. I know when I would interview, I would look at them and say, is this the same person? Mm-hmm. So they're just checking that. So this question is, what about if you're discharged from a company for a simple mistake? What do you put down for your reason for leaving?
Involuntary separation has been the best method I have found for that. You can't lie. Don't play fast and loose with the truth. Don't say you were laid off if you were fired. People get fired all the time for the reasons you're talking about. And again, I'm not in any way saying one's right, one's wrong, because I have no idea, and neither will the employer. All they know is it going to affect me? And if you try to explain that it was a simple mistake and it was a misunderstanding and they were being totally irrational, you're trying to justify your side of the story, which I get on a personal level. would be very offensive to me if I got fired, and I'd want to advocate for myself. An application is not the proper time to do that. In fact, an interview is not the proper time to do that. All you need to do is explain in the interview what happened, very kind of dispassionate way. You know, there was an issue with a policy that I didn't fully understand. Unfortunately, that did lead to my being let go. However, I have 15 years of experience of directly related to this position, and I'm so excited to restart my career with you. On an application, just put involuntary separation. Gloria?
I have quite a few comments on what do you do if the business that you used to work for has closed and there's no way they can check a reference or get a hold of anyone to find out and verify the dates you work there?
Again, do whatever you can. I've had people go as far as, you know, this costs money, going to the Social Security Administration and creating an account. And it's a process. It's not real difficult, but it's a lot of work for them to look up that information. If you paid taxes, they can sometimes be able to find the dates of employment through that. And I think it costs like $100 or something like that. Don't quote me on that. However, there is a process to find it out from that if it's that important to you, or that important in your job search. On the other side of it, I've had an employer that was transferred. They changed the name 4 times, and I thought there's no way I'm going to be able to get this. I did call. It took a month. It took a couple reminder emails, friendly reminder emails, but they went into the basement of the records that got shipped over, and they were able to give it to me. So don't assume you can't do it. Give it your due diligence. We'll get one more question before we move on.
Okay, is there ever a time limit for applicable, I can't say that word today, skills? For example, having experience with an old programming language that has been replaced with a new one, would you still list that as a skill?
I wouldn't list, like, this is a great example because I knew how to do Pascal frontwards and backwards. I thought that was great. You know, this is going to be a career for me. If anyone even knows what Pascal is, it was a 1980s computer programming language. And that doesn't mean that I can't market that skill. It just means I'm not going to date myself by using that name, Fortran, Pascal, COBOL, whatever. Just talk about, understand the process of computer languages and familiar with several different disciplines, something like that. Now, if you haven't touched that skill set since that time of those outdated skills, you've got to be honest about it. Do I still have those skills? Could I still refresh myself in a short period of time enough to show value for that employer? What I usually recommend is, if it's an old skill, refresh it. Go online, find a course. There are tons of courses, more than ever, by the way, out there for training. Some are absolutely free. So a great example would be if you used to do some office work, but for the last 5 years, you've been doing maybe construction, but you want to get back into office work, but you haven't touched a computer really in a work situation in 5 years. Go on to gcflearnfree.org. I'll send that link in the notes I send tomorrow, but that has massive amounts of free, excellent training on office software like Word, Excel, Access, PowerPoint. And you don't maybe have current work skills, but you had them in the past, you've refreshed them, and you can talk about that. I've been keeping up to date with my skills, even though I haven't been doing it in a work situation. I know it's of value, so I've taken these 3 courses. It can't hurt, and it shows an employer that you're very proactive with your skill sets. You understand their need and why an employer would find value. So yes, explanation. So let's talk about a very important skill throughout work, but especially on an application and in a resume, and that is proofreading. So I'm going to put up a screen here in just a moment, and it's going to be 4 lines of text. All I want you to do is read through the white box and count the number of F's you see. I'm not trying to trick you in any way. Count the number of F's in these 4 lines, and in the chat box, just tell me, how many F's do you see? Take 10, 15 seconds, read through it, count the number of F's, and put it in the chat box, please. Okay, so I see some 3s, some 4s, 3, 4, 6, got a 3. Haven't come with a 5 yet. Anyone got a 5? A lot of 3s. Okay. So, by the way, this is not an intelligence test. It's not to make anyone feel bad, but it's going to, I hope, prove a point to me. This is a very simple exercise. I'm asking you to look at 4 lines of text with a fresh set of eyes. You have no, previous experience with this. You're objectively looking at it, and you are seeing finished, files, and scientific. And you're right, there are 3, but there's also 3 more. And when you first hear that, many people who saw 3 will read it again and say, nope, there are 3. I'm a smart person. I can read. There's only 3. What you missed was the of, and the of. I saw this in the late 90s in a late night news program. I've been using it for many years to prove a point, and that is it's extremely easy to miss something, even if you're looking at it with a fresh set of eyes. Imagine how hard it is to look at it with a set of eyes that knows, oh, no, I know this stuff. I've lived this. You cannot effectively proofread your own resume at a certain level, meaning that you're too close to it. Applications too. The first couple times you fill out an application, I highly recommend, I'll send everyone a sample application, fill it out, and then have someone proofread it. And then you have kind of a sample to work with. You get better at it the more you fill out, but you always got to look at, have I done the best job I can to present myself to an employer the way I want? And part of that is avoid any mistakes, because mistakes have an outsized say at that stage. Because I haven't met you, I haven't seen you, I haven't talked to you. All I'm seeing is this piece of paper in front of me. And if there's a misspelling or formatting error or an omission, I'm going to notice that and it's going to stick out. In some of the presentations I've given, I've purposely put an error in, and invariably someone will point it out privately in the chat. They'll say, oh, I know you probably hate when people say this, but that's this instead of this. And I use that as a point, as when I see the error, I focus on the error. I don't focus on the message. So anyways, just fun little exercise. Take it for what you will. Glory?
We have a few questions in regards to, do you put your social security number on the application? Would it be better if you just listed your last 4 numbers? Do you have to put your birthday on the application if they're asking?
So this is where it gets complicated. If it's a larger employer, more than likely they are fully aware of the legal restrictions for asking questions. In many cases, those types of questions are more for legally, so that they can't discriminate against people. They're asking for information so they can prove to the government that they are considering everyone. So questions like race and age and all those kinds of things, well, here, you can't ask that on an application. Well, they're not technically part of the application. They're part of the additional documentation they need to submit to the government to say we are actively marketing these jobs to a wide variety of people. And so it's actually anti-discrimination policies that lead to those questions being asked. If it's a smaller employer and you're just not sure, that's a great opportunity to call and very nicely say, I see that you're asking for my Social Security at this stage. I've never seen that before on this type of application. Could you please let me know what that will be used for? It's a great opportunity to reach out. Just never do it from anger, or you may not have been aware, but you can't ask that. That usually doesn't work out well because it creates that negative first impression. Use it as an opportunity to reach out and create that connection. Also look it up online. Look up, the questions that are being asked. There are social media sites like Glassdoor and even on LinkedIn. Sometimes you can create some discussions, but Glassdoor is a good one. I'll include that link where people will, talk about the application process with certain employers. A lot's being changed. On some applications, they actually make you do a video interview, a canned video interview. I know there are some companies that do that I never would have thought anyone could have possibly done in the past, but it is legal and they are doing it, and pointing it out to an employer that you are uncomfortable answering that has to be handled very carefully. Yes, Gloria?
What do you do if your top skills are not in demand?
Well, then you need to, well, I mean, if you do something very well that no one's asking for, you need to apply for other jobs. And if you have a skills gaps, you have to just understand, is there a need for retraining? Is there an entry-level position that would allow me to be trained on the job to the skills I want? If your top skills aren't in demand, that's not something you market. But think about, is there any way I could break down that skill to component parts that are transferable? It's tricky, I get it, but I use the printing industry quite often because you may be an incredible typesetter and the best in the world, but if there are no jobs for that, it doesn't do you any good to market it about yourself. And that's really hard to let go of because we define ourselves in a large way through what we've done at work. That's why it's a second question anyone asks you, what do you do for a living? When we lose that, we really have to start redefining how we market ourselves. And if you market skills, relevant skills, rather than job titles or irrelevant skills, it's going to create a clearer picture and it's going to provide more opportunities. But that takes some self-reflection. That takes some taking a few assessments, see what's out there. It's not easy. I'm not saying it is, but it's something that every job seeker should go through before they start applying for jobs. All right. We did talk about this a little bit. Best language on your resume, on the application for if you were fired is an involuntary separation. If you were truly laid off, you can go into a little bit more information because some people who were fired will say they were laid off. So say, company-wide layoff involving 100 employees. That to me is enough information I'm going to understand. It wasn't your fault. It was just a company decision. If it was your choice, if you resigned or you quit, don't say quit. And that's the same reason we don't say terminated or fired. It's too negative a word. It has too much negative power. So when you say quit, I wonder, well, did you just leave the employer hanging? Did you give a 2-week notice? You could say voluntary separation due to family relocation. Okay? Now, they can't ask you about your family, but I could tell them that information because it benefited me. Just because they can ask, sometimes, and you got to be careful about this, sometimes giving them some information actually benefits you because it explains the situation. Something to consider. So next we're going to talk about in the last 5 minutes here, real quickly, is portfolios. So portfolios are something that you should be putting together as you're creating your job search strategy. It'll include your resume, potentially a standard cover letter or the specific cover letter if you're bringing your portfolio to an interview, a reference sheet, and they should all be on separate pieces of paper, and they should all look the same. Just because you get help on a resume doesn't mean that your cover letter should look like something completely different. You can take that brand, that font, those margins, the heading that you use to put your name and address, they can look the same. It's just taking it from one to the other. Maybe a letter of recommendation you could include. If at all possible, put it on company letterhead if the employer will do that. Very few will, but I'm saying you can ask because now that letter of recommendation isn't from John Smith, it's from the state of Minnesota or Enbridge Energy or whatever. It has more impact if it comes from the company as opposed to an individual. You also can consider work samples, pictures of welds that you have done, samples of marketing pieces you have put together, sample code in a programming language, whatever it happens to be. Maybe you're a designer and it's the more traditional portfolio of artistic pictures. And then copies of any certifications or licensures, because you're going to have to prove anything you put on your resume. If at an interview you give them the proof, that was a deciding factor in me hiring someone once, was their portfolio, because it proved everything that they were talking about. They gave me work samples. They gave me copies of their certificates. They had a former employer talk about the skills they had been marketing, and that goes further to proving those skills. It's not going to be relevant in every job situation, but I think it's something you should keep in the back of your mind, start developing, and it's a great takeaway for an employer. You leave them with a folder with that information, gives them something to think about. So let me give you an example of branding. If I had that looks something like this, and then I had a cover letter that looked like this, the employer is going to assume the lesser. They're going to assume skills are actually here. This is what I'm getting. This is what you got help with. So you want to meet expectations at every stage. So make sure that simple as taking this information and adding it to this using the same font can create that. See the difference there? Let me go back and forth. What's going to make a better impression? This? It's the same exact information. It's the same exact content, but the impression is improved because of branding, because you took the time and effort to make it look similar. Reference sheet would be very much the same. We just got a couple of minutes left here, and Glory, if there are any questions we need to get to, this would be the time to do it.
Yes, so let me just see here. There's a few questions that we're just going to have to answer through email because we do have a lot of them coming in. But let's see here. Okay, this one says, I do wish to apply for film editor. What if you made films and graduated from college, but the last semester your hard drive crashed? So you don't have any proof that you have that experience.
That's fine. You can still talk about the process. You can give examples of what you did. I wouldn't mention that the hard drive crashed and you lost all your work because that would be a negative, but you can talk about the process. They're not going to say, well, give me proof, send it to me. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. But talk about the software package you used to edit, and talk about the things you learned and where you were successful in that process. And here's absolute key, and this is job search as a whole. Talk about how much you enjoyed it.
Yes.
Employers are looking for job satisfaction because people who are satisfied with their job stay at their job. And we get so nervous in our job search that we're robotic in talking about things. At the end of that interview, they should know, if nothing else, that you want this job, that you're interested in this job. Too many employers hire someone with the right skills and the wrong attitude, and they don't last. I'd much rather hire someone with the right attitude that I could train into a position, because they're someone who is going to stick with this job because they like this type of work. And that's really important and not always obvious in the interviews that I've been part of, for people to show or that they've been given that direction. All right, yes. We're straight up 11 o'clock. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate your time today. Please remember to reach out to your local career force location with any additional needs you may have. But I will be sending you a lot of information to get you started on that skills identification. And again, appreciate your time. Have a great day, and I wish you the best of luck in your job search.